As we celebrate the birthday of President Abraham Lincoln this month, many people reflect on the Civil War he led the country through in the 1860s, a tumultuous time that eventually led to a stronger Union. Adirondack author Glenn Pearsall, in his book *Leaves Torn Asunder*, pays tribute to men and women of the Adirondacks who could not escape inevitable tragedies as bloody battles tore through the North and the South. Pearsall was kind enough to invite me to a recent book launch in the town where he lives, North Creek, where I interviewed him in front of an audience at the Tannery Pond Center. More recently, the author and I spoke again in our studio at Mountain Lake PBS. Well, you've written a novel, your first novel. How did you go from being a writer of nonfiction books to writing your first fiction?
When you start digging into history, the deeper and deeper you dig, you come to realize these were real people, just much like we're people today, with their own issues, their own concerns, problems. And I felt by telling a fictionalized story, a novel, if you will, about the era would go to deeper truths versus just a resuscitation of facts and figures and who fought in what battles and who survived.
So this is about the Civil War in the Adirondacks. What draws you to the Civil War period?
Well, my middle name is Lincoln, so I think I was naturally predisposed to study the Civil War and been focused on it since 5th grade, which, as you can see from my white hair, has been a few years now. But I was also interested that there's been very little written about the Adirondacks during this era, during the Civil War. And we forget that New York State lost more soldiers than any other state in the Civil War, and it was particularly devastating in these small communities in the Adirondacks.
So this is a historical fiction. It's very close to what really happened in terms of your research.
Yes, back in 2008, I did a program at our local community theater. Spent 2 hours actually talking about Civil War soldiers I had researched. And folks wanted me to write a book about it. So I kind of put it on the back burner. And then 3 years later, early in the morning, I woke up and just started typing.
You started typing. Did you ever at any point write an outline or think about the structure of this book?
No, the characters just came to life in my subconscious with their individual personalities, all based on actual historic people, things that actually had happened to them. But in my mind, in my subconscious, I developed personalities, manners of speaking, ways of interaction, and I basically wrote the novel in 10 weeks.
Wow, that's incredible. So you were just basically sitting at your computer, and instead of a structure, you were just writing paragraphs and sentences as they came to you.
As they came. It was almost like a stream of consciousness in terms of how I did it. But then, of course, I had to do the rewrite. I wrote the novel, about 53,000 words in 10 weeks. But then I spent a year rewriting it. I took out about 15,000 words and added about another 25,000 back in again. And that was really the hard work, the constant self-editing. But the writing was frustrating only that I had these images in my mind and I couldn't get them down on paper fast enough.
So they were coming at you faster than you could write. Weren't they even coming to you at times when you weren't sitting at your computer?
To a degree. Sometimes I would wait, and my wife laughs about this, but sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I'd say, I got to change that word. You know, it had just been rolling around in the back of my mind, and I found a better word to describe something.
How about when you were doing everyday tasks, such as driving or eating dinner?
Certainly driving. You know, you'd drive to a certain location, and you'd realize 5 minutes later that you had passed it, because your mind was thinking about the action within the story.
You mentioned your wife. How important was your wife, Carol, in the process?
She has been a tremendous help through all my books. This is actually my 3rd one. And she is my semi-official proofreader, because I think much faster than I can type. In doing my own reading, I tend to read 25 to 50 books a year. I tend to speed read. So I found it increasingly difficult to proofread my own book. And one of her big criticisms, interestingly enough, was I was always messing up the tense. I'd be writing about something in the past as if it was in the present, because that's where my mind was.
Oh, that's fascinating.
But also, you know, things like spell check don't solve all your problems. And we had to go through the book to make sure we didn't have any modern day colloquialisms that would not be used during that time period. So yeah, she was a very big help to me.
Well, what would you like us to know about the plot of your book?
To my mind, it's not just a story of farm boys from the Adirondacks heading off to the Civil War, this great big adventure. They thought the war would be over in 3 months. What a great excuse to get off the farm and the boredom of hard farm duties they had every day, put on a uniform, and fight for the glory of the United States. But of course, as we know from our history books, it didn't last 3 months, it lasted 4 years. But just as important as the transition they went through in how they conducted themselves, I was fascinated by what was happening back on the Adirondack farms themselves. It's always been tough farming in the Adirondacks, but it was especially tough when all these men and older boys were all fighting a war. Who was going to plow the fields? Who was going to hay the harvest? Who was going to chop the endless wood they needed to heat the place? And in many ways, I found that the courage of the families back home equal or exceeded the bravery of the soldiers fighting for their lives on the battlefield.
You have some very strong women characters, speaking of the people who didn't go fighting but stayed back home and often had to run the farms. Why was it important to you to talk about the lives of the women during the Civil War?
Well, I tried to imagine what it was like, Paul. I mean, just think about plowing fields and how that was hard work for young men. And to have women have to do that because the men weren't there and they had to get the crops in. This is an agrarian economy back then. You know, if you wanted food for the winter, you had to grow it. If you wanted to keep the farmhouse warm, you had to chop the wood. There was nobody else around to do it. And one of the stories I actually tell is of a young boy who tries to fill his father's shoes during the haying of buckwheat, which was a very popular crop back then, and the incident that evolved from that.
Which is a tragedy.
It really is. It was an unexpected thing. I don't know. That was one of the things I created in the book. I don't know that actually happened, but I can certainly see that it might have happened.
So we won't give away everything about the book, but I would like you to read a little bit from the book just to give us a flavor.
Certainly. If I may just read a little bit about Nancy, who is the wife of my main character, Wesley Somerville. And after many years of trying, they finally have a child, but when the child is born, the child is not healthy. Nancy put Emma back in the cradle. It was time, and they both needed rest. Wesley was already snoring away, tired to the bone after all his farm chores, and trying to help Nancy with the infant. Nancy, exhausted, climbed into bed and immediately fell asleep. Nancy stirred and moaned. The room was pitch black. It was the middle of the night, but she instinctively knew it was time to feed Emma again. As she climbed out of the bed, she realized with some alarm it was past time. Carefully lighting a candle, she threw a light blanket across her shoulders and quietly walked over to Emma's crib. She unwrapped the light blanket from around Emma and picked her up. To her shock and dismay, she realized that Emma was unresponsive, limp, and cold to the touch. Nancy herself seemed to turn cold at the realization Emma was dead. She sat down in the rocking chair next to Emma's cradle, holding the lifeless body in her arms, rocked the child back and forth, sobbing and sobbing well into the night. Emma had lived for barely 3 weeks.
That's very vivid, that passage. You've written about extremely realistic people in very vivid settings. You did a lot of research for this book, and you even looked at photographs.
Yes, I did. And that was an inspiration for a lot of things that I did. There's one we have of the Robert Armstrong house, and it shows several men standing in front of a farmhouse, and there's a woman there and a dog. And I tried to say, what were they thinking at the time? What were they like? Then move that into the characterization of the people that I had created.
Well, also in your research, you came across this image of a crowd of people in a room. What's happening here?
Well, part of the fun of doing the research is I went down to the Cooperstown Farmers Museum to try to get a sense of really what it was like on Adirondack farms at the period in which I was writing the book. And this is a group of people getting together in the fall, kind of a celebration of the harvest. And there was an old custom that unmarried women would peel an apple, which if you peel an apple, you know how it kind of curls around. They would throw that over their shoulder and then look to see how it landed on the floor, and that was supposed to be the initials of the man they were fated to marry. And I included that in my novel. I thought that was something kind of cute. And I visited with somebody, and they said it was not that long ago that they stopped doing that.
That's very interesting. Well, let's talk about the book cover. Did it take you a while to decide on an image?
It really did. The hardest part sometimes of writing is to put a name to the cover. And I decided on Leaves Torn Asunder, because if you ever walk through the woods, especially in the Adirondacks in the fall, and a heavy wind comes up at the end of fall foliage, you get rained down upon all these leaves. And it gave me the image of all these soldiers falling to the earth after being shot up in war. So once I decided on the title, then I thought, what am I going to do for a cover? Because I'm constantly told how important a cover is to a book. You want it attractive so people will pull it off the shelf. You don't want to give away the whole story, but also you don't want to misrepresent what you're doing. So I went around to the local cemeteries taking pictures of actual headstones of Civil War veterans, and I liked the fall colors, so I did that. Some I had flags with that were there. I didn't touch anything. But then I got concerned that maybe it would come across as a book of poetry. Leaves torn asunder, and this kind of bucolic scene with the leaves and so forth. Even tried throwing leaves in the air, taking pictures of them with a fast, sport speed camera to catch them in the air, and nothing really came together until I discovered a photo that won a photography contest in the state of Virginia. And it's a great scene that shows a Civil War cannon with fall foliage around it at the Battle of Wilderness, and coincidentally, the climax of my story happens in the Battle of Wilderness. So I contacted the photographer, and he very graciously let me use the picture for a couple of the books.
And how does he feel having his image on the cover of your book?
He seemed quite thrilled. He asked for a couple of copies. I'm sure he shared them with all his friends. He's quite the photographer. He's won many awards, but I think this is his first book cover.
Do you think you'll write another novel?
I suspect I will. It's a lot of work, and I'm still recovering from the emotion that I went through in writing this one. It was quite exhausting. But this is my third book. There probably will be a fourth.
Pearsall says his next novel may involve the great land barons discovering the Adirondacks in the late 1800s and the historic rail journey Theodore Roosevelt took from North Creek toward the White House. Leaves Torn Asunder is now available at many Adirondack booksellers and Amazon.com.